You finally got them down. 20 minutes of the slow sway, the careful lean, the millimeter by millimeter descent toward the mattress. You held your breath. You pulled your arms away 1 degree at a time, like defusing something. And for 1 perfect second, they were asleep, in the crib, on their own. Then the eyes opened. Then the face crumpled. Then the sound started. You picked them up. And instantly, silence. The crying stopped before it fully began. They melted into your chest like something slotting back into place, like a circuit completing. And you thought, I'm spoiling them. Or, they're manipulating me. Or, if I keep doing this, I will still be doing this when they leave for college. Every parent who has ever lived inside that loop has Googled some version of how to get baby to stop wanting to be held. They've read the sleep training forums, they've bought the swaddle with the 5-star reviews, they've called the pediatrician feeling faintly embarrassed. Some of it helps. None of it explains why. But developmental psychologists have spent decades studying exactly this, not as a sleep problem to be fixed, but as a communication system to be decoded. And what they found doesn't just change how you see the holding, it changes what you understand about what your baby actually is. So here's the real question. What is your baby actually telling you every single time they reach up and refuse to let go? The most common answer, the one that gets passed down through generations, the one your relatives deliver with total confidence, is this. You're conditioning them. Babies want to be held because they've learned that crying produces holding. You're reinforcing a behavior. You're building dependence. If you just hold firm, eventually they'll learn to self-soothe. Eventually they'll figure out that the crib is safe, it sounds reasonable, it maps onto basic behavioral logic. Reward a behavior, get more of it. The practical advice version of this has a name most people recognize. Spoiling. And for decades, it was the dominant framework. Even some pediatric guidance leaned into it. Put them down, let them fuss, don't rush in. You're doing them a favor. Here's the problem. The spoiling hypothesis has been formally tested and the data goes in exactly the opposite direction. Longitudinal research tracking infants from birth into toddlerhood, including foundational work by developmental psychologists Sylvia Bell and Mary Ainsworth published in the journal A Child Development, found that babies whose bids to be held were answered promptly and consistently did not become more clingy over time. They became more independent. The more reliably the need was met in infancy, the faster the child developed the internal confidence to tolerate being alone. Meeting the need extinguished it. Ignoring it amplified it. Your baby isn't becoming dependent on you. Your baby is building the neurological architecture that will one day allow them to be alone. But here's where the science stops being counterintuitive and starts being genuinely strange. Because the need to be held isn't primarily psychological in origin. It is biological. And it goes deeper than comfort. Researchers at the Touch Research Institute at the University of Miami, where Dr. Tiffany Field has spent decades studying the physiological effects of contact on infant development, have documented something that reframes the entire conversation. When infants are set down, not in distress, not hungry, not in pain, simply placed on a flat surface during a wakeful period, their cortisol levels rise measurably within minutes, roughly the time it takes you to walk to another room and come back. When they are picked back up, cortisol drops back to baseline. Consistently, predictably, the held state is not a reward the baby is angling for. It is the infant's physiological default. Being put down is, to the nervous system, a departure from baseline, a deviation, a signal that something has changed. To understand why, you need a metaphor for what a newborn's regulatory system actually looks like. Think of it as a thermostat with no internal heating unit. It can read the temperature. It can register that the temperature has dropped. It cannot produce heat on its own. Your body is the furnace. Holding isn't an add-on, a layer of comfort placed on top of normal infant function. Holding is the infrastructure. It is the system running. Your baby isn't crying because they want attention. Your baby is crying because their nervous system has just registered a threat, and your arms are the only thing in the world that turns it off. Now I need to tell you about what happens inside the developing brain. During those minutes, the holding isn't happening, because cortisol is the surface signal. Underneath it, something is being constructed, or failing to be constructed, at the level of neural architecture most parents never hear about. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has produced some of the most rigorously documented research on what they call toxic stress. the effect of recurrent, unresolved physiological stress on the developing brain. Their findings are specific and, once you understand them, difficult to unknow. Repeated cortisol activation in the first year of life doesn't toughen the infant nervous system. It sensitizes it. What's being calibrated during this window is the HPA axis, the hormonal loop connecting the brain to the adrenal glands, the core infrastructure of how a person responds to stress for the rest of their life. The calibration is use-dependent. Whatever stress levels the system experiences most frequently becomes the set point, the baseline. The default sensitivity for every difficult moment that follows. The first 12 months of life represent the most sensitive period for this calibration, a window roughly the length of one full calendar year in which the architecture of a person's lifelong stress response is being actively written. Additional work from attachment researchers in Europe has pointed towards something even more specific, that physical contact in infancy is associated with measurable differences in the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for emotional regulation, decision-making, and the capacity to handle uncertainty without falling apart. Which means the question, should I hold them so much, is not really a question about sleep habits. It is a question about what kind of stress response hardware you are helping your child build right now, today, in this moment. Your baby isn't learning helplessness every time you pick them up. Your baby's stress system is being set to a lower, calmer baseline. One that will shape how they handle pressure for the rest of their life. Now I need to tell you about the experiment that made all of this concrete. Because it is one thing to discuss cortisol and neural architecture in the abstract. It is something else entirely to watch what these patterns look like inside a real relationship in real time. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, developmental psychologist Dr. Mary Ainsworth designed what became one of the most replicated studies in the history of child psychology, the strange situation procedure. The setup was deceptively ordinary. A caregiver and infant were brought into an unfamiliar room. A stranger entered. The caregiver briefly left, then the caregiver returned. Ainsworth wasn't primarily interested in the separation. She was interested in the reunion, specifically in how the infant used the caregiver's physical presence when they came back. What she found sorted infants into patterns that have held up across cultures, across decades, across hundreds of thousands of replications. Infants whose bids to be held had been reliably answered in daily life used the caregiver's return to regulate. They settled, and then they turned back to explore. Infants whose bids had been inconsistently met clung and could not settle. The body remained activated even after the threat had passed. And infants whose bids had been consistently ignored did something that looked on the surface like the healthiest response of all. They appeared indifferent. They didn't reach up, they didn't cry, they seemed unbothered. But cortisol measurements taken from those infants told a different story. Their stress levels were the highest in the room. They had not stopped needing. They had learned not to signal the need. They had done the math on whether reaching up produced a response and concluded that it didn't, and they had gone quiet. Every time you answer the reach, you are not reinforcing a bad habit. You are casting a vote in the architecture of how your child will ask for help for the rest of their life, whether they will believe that expressed need produces response, whether the circuit between vulnerability and connection stays open or slowly closes. Your baby isn't manipulating you when they reach up and cry. Your baby is asking the most fundamental question a human being can ask: if I need you, will you come? And your answer is building the circuitry that governs every close relationship they will ever have. And now I need to say something important. Because everything covered so far is about what the holding does when it's working. But there is another side to this. A specific pattern of contact behavior that most parents either miss or explain away. And it matters. There are two things worth watching for. The first is a baby who consistently doesn't reach, who is clearly in distress, face crumpled, breath ragged, but who does not lift their arms toward the caregiver, does not make eye contact during distress, and does not appear to use the caregiver's physical presence to regulate. The second is a baby who cannot be regulated by holding at all, who remains at peak distress even with full body contact regardless of feeding or pain, in a way that feels qualitatively different from ordinary fussiness. Neither of these is a diagnosis. Neither is a reason to panic. Some babies are temperamentally slow to warm. Some have sensory processing differences that make certain types of contact overstimulating rather than soothing, which requires a different kind of attunement rather than more volume of holding. The observation is not the conclusion. It is the beginning of a conversation. The developmental timeline to hold in mind is this: the intentional reaching up gesture, arms extended toward the caregiver during distress, typically emerges somewhere between 4 and 6 months, as the motor system matures enough to support it. By 9 months, most infants show clear preferential reaching toward a primary caregiver over a stranger. If either of those milestones is significantly absent by the end of the first year, that is the window where a conversation with a pediatrician is most productive, not because something is certainly wrong, because the brain's capacity for change is never higher than it is right now, and early attention produces results that later attention cannot replicate. You have held this baby more times than you can count. You know what their normal reach feels like, what their distress sounds like, what it means when they settle, and what it means when they don't. If something about the way they ask to be held, or don't ask, has been sitting in the back of your mind, that is not anxiety, that is data. Trust it. Here's what sits underneath all of this. Human infants arrive in the world more physiologically incomplete than the newborn of almost any other mammal. A foal stands within hours. A human infant cannot support its own head. Evolutionary biologists describe this as secondary altriciality, the idea that the human brain grew so large, so rapidly across evolutionary time, that birth had to happen earlier than the organism is ready, because waiting any longer would make delivery impossible. The infant arrives unfinished. The nervous system is mid-construction. The stress response wiring is still being laid, and the environment that wiring was designed to be laid inside, the environment evolution spent a very long time calibrating for, is a body, a heartbeat, 2 arms that close when the arms reach up. The 4th trimester is not a metaphor. It is a developmental stage, and your arms are the architecture it was designed for. So the next time you spend 20 minutes getting them down, and they open their eyes the moment you pull away, remember what is actually happening. Their cortisol is rising because you are the only thermostat they have. Their stress response circuitry is being calibrated right now, in this room, by whether or not you come back. The attachment wiring that will run underneath every significant relationship of their life is being built one answered reach at a time. You are not being manipulated. You are being needed in the most precise biological sense of that word. You are not spoiling them. You are finishing them. Drop a comment below and tell me, was there a moment where you stopped second-guessing the holding? Where you put down the advice and just picked them up? Tell me how old they were. Tell me what shifted, because I want to know. And if you want to understand why your baby goes completely still the moment the room gets tense, not because they understand the words, not because they're picking up on volume alone, but because of something happening inside their threat detection system that most parents completely misread, that is the next video. And once you understand what they're actually reading in those moments, you will never think about what babies absorb from the emotional atmosphere around them the same way again.